So we'll have tonight a brief webinar training regarding a CEO's perspective on retaining talents through online technology. So um, okay, so we'll have it from 6 p.m. to 7:45 p.m. So for tonight, we will be joined by an entrepreneur, software developer, a trainer, and data consultant. His passions include financial inclusion and social change through big data and digital analytics. His current work includes digital peer-to-peer credit with Uploan, big data for small and medium enterprises with Serialytics, digital transformation for contact centers with Augment BPO, and incubating analytics freelancing in the Philippines with Alpha Zeta. Let us all welcome the founder and managing consultant of Serialytics, Mr. Dominic Ligot. Hi, Doc. Hi, Doc. Good evening.
Hello. Good
Hi.
evening
Good
to
evening,
everyone.
Doc. Okay.
Yep.
I'll just transfer it.
Sige, sige.
Okay, Doc.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, Doc.
Okay. Okay. Good evening, everyone. There are 20 of us here. It's a nice, lovely, rainy evening. I think it's a perfect time to learn about employee retention, right? Yeah. So anyway, thanks, Rina, for the kind background. I just want to start by just giving you a better background about myself. First thing is, I'm not really a doctor. No, doctor is my nickname. And I'm also, just to be very clear, I'm not really officially an HR professional. So all of my experience in people and HR has been as a line manager or as a business owner. So right now, uh, what apart from what Rina mentioned, I'm actually managing three companies, which, as you can imagine, is not really very nice on on your schedule. It's a good thing that we were able to find time for us to talk this afternoon. So the company I spend the most time with is Cyrolytics. It's a data and consulting company. Uploan is a fintech. So I don't know if some of you have heard of the fintech phenomenon. It's these small companies looking to provide financial services. So that's my second company. My third company is a little closer to HR. So People Link Staffing Solutions. It's a manpower and recruitment agency. Yeah. Can you see my screen now? Okay. So my background, as I said, is not really HR. It's really more of data management and analytics. I also teach digital marketing in the CDM. And before I got into actually technology, I spent 15 years in the banking sector, so primarily a risk manager. But that's actually given me an interesting perspective. So for me, when I see questions like retention or HR, I tend to look at management or a digital marketing lens, which sometimes puts me at odds with actual HR professionals. So hopefully, you guys get a little bit of what I think as a business owner, what I will look for from a person who will manage my HR, but at the same time, try to also bring to HR things that I learned in banking and finance and all these other disciplines. So before I started my companies, I used to work in a data company called Teradata. And before that, I was with Australian New Zealand Bank and HSBC. And I also do lecturing on the side. In terms of line management, about 18 years, managing teams of various sizes. The peak of it was when I was with ANZ, where I was at one point in time handling about 150 people, which may be big or small depending on your respective backgrounds. Some people are used to managing thousands of people, and well, some people they think 20 people is a lot. So I've had the both the privilege and the hassle of having to manage 150 people, and that means managing managers of managers of managers. So those of you who do performance reviews, can probably relate to how hard that was. So today we're going to talk about retaining talent, and the agenda is pretty straightforward, but I'll try to talk through some of the points. And hopefully, I don't put you to sleep with the PowerPoint. The first is we'll cover a little bit, some perspective on what employees value. This is based both on my experience and stuff that you can research by yourself. And I think most of you are HR professionals. You probably know a lot of this already, but I just wanted to talk through it because it will help cement the kind of the thesis or the idea that I want to put forward in this 1 hour session, which is data is really the differentiator between good retention and bad retention. And I'll talk a little bit about, I mean, it's just incidental that I come from a data background, but I also see this as a big opportunity for HR in general to step up. Because I don't know if people will agree, but over the decades, I see HR as probably one of the laggards in adopting really solid data management compared to, peers in finance or marketing. Those fields tend to be quite data driven. But the good news is there's a lot of HR data and HR analytics happening now. And some of you guys might have already been exposed to it. But I'm going to talk a little bit about it today as well, as a way of kind of cementing the point. And then I'm going to conclude with what I would call a digital retention strategy, which will kind of bring all the points together. So everything from, what is talent management from a data perspective? How do you manage the life cycle of employees, similar to how marketers supposedly manage customer life cycle? Some examples of HR analytics. There's a lot. I'm not going to talk about everything, but maybe the top four as a CEO, I would probably want to know, like 4 questions I want to know, and by association, have the HR people focus on that. And I think it will all culminate in, at the end of the day, the challenge of most companies is how do you get a better handle of your HR data, which is the HRIS. The concept of an HRIS has been around forever, but I have yet to really find a really, really solid HRIS in practice, both when I was still a consultant, consulting for big companies. And even worse now that I'm running my own business, I even struggle myself with getting HR data sorted. But the good news is there's a lot of online services that purport to do that. So that might be interesting for everyone here. And the reason why these services are thriving, the punchline is, it's because companies are so bad at it and they'd rather just pay someone else. So maybe by introducing some of these companies, I'm not really endorsing anyone in particular, you might get the idea that if HR departments and companies were better at doing it themselves, then maybe these companies wouldn't really have a business. But the fact is they do. Okay, so let's zoom out first and talk about attracting and retaining good employees. What are really like the top three, I would say, overriding factors? And this is consistent, it's not just the theory behind it. This is also what I believe as a C-level. The first is selecting the right people is obviously the first step, right? If you are able to select the right people and they share your values, they share your passions, then there's a higher chance that they will stick around. And that's sometimes at odds with recruitment, because recruitment will focus on other things as well, minimizing the salary cost, the right skills, padamihan ng checklists, do you have this skill or that skill? I mean, that's all good. But I tend to, kind of think over the years, it's really the people who share the company's values and my values as well as a CEO who tend to stick around. And vice versa, when I was once upon a time also an employee, I tend to stick to managers who I also believe in. There's always a saying that people join companies, but they leave their managers. I don't necessarily believe that that's like a tried and tested formula, but I think the underpinning there is you will tend to work in a company that you believe in. If you don't believe in that company, it doesn't matter if they pay you a lot, you'll end up finding a reason to go. And that's the second factor, okay? So you find the right people, they also have to find the right working environment inside the organization. So what's your culture? And this is actually a big deal nowadays, no? Because once upon a time, I would say, when I was getting into the job market in the late 90s, there was really hardly any venue to do research about companies. But nowadays, there are chat rooms, there are websites, there are services like Glassdoor and LinkedIn, where you can really kind of get a clue already if you're a prospective applicant about how life is in a company. And that's unprecedented. That's also put some pressure on not just HR departments, but also CEOs in general to be a bit more careful what they do, right? Because if people are blogging about your company and it's freely accessible on the internet, then you're screwed. You can't really find, people willing to work for you. And that kind of makes HR slightly a bit more like a marketing job already. The same way marketers take care of their digital presence of their company doesn't detract from customers. You also have to manage HR, the kind of the perception of employees or future recruits. So nadagdagan ang trabaho ni HR. Unlike before, it was primarily operational. Now you have to be somewhat of a marketer as well. Or maybe it's always been that way, but nowadays the fact that you have social media just makes it more difficult. And that's the external influence. So third, like, what is the labor market in general, or the overall economic climate? And we can talk forever about this, but at the end of the day, nowadays HR professionals are pressured, and CEOs are also pressured to keep abreast of what are the trends happening in the labor market. And that's actually, if I want to talk a little bit more specifically about what I'm doing, one of the major projects I'm doing now is how to help BPOs, counter the threat of AI. And that's a big, discussion nowadays in the Senate. What if one day robots can do the job of a call center worker? What does that mean for me if I own a BPO, for example? So that's like a technology threat. But from an HR standpoint, that means I need to make sure that A, my people are ready for that, they have the right skills, and B, how am I going to get better, like AI savvy employees in the future? So but once upon a time, no one really cared about that. Suddenly, nowadays, science fiction is becoming reality. So that's an external influence. I'll come back to that later as well because there's so many things about this new, they call it the fourth industrial revolution, how this affects companies. So one of the challenges, this is back in the day, especially in the bank, you can't really run any operation in a company without funds, right? And HR, I don't know if some of you are lucky, I would probably generalize, isn't really top of the agenda when it comes to budgets. The marketing department gets it, maybe finance will get it, sales will get it. And I think HR will join the ranks of maybe IT and some of the more back office duties in terms of taking priority in terms of investment. And I want to kind of show this slide as a way of encouraging HR professionals and also fellow CEOs to rethink that, because at the end of the day, it's not, you're not running a company of robots, at least not yet. You're not running a company of assets, despite the balance sheet. Everyone runs a company of people, and your customers are also people. Your employees are people, your managers are people. And if you make a mistake there, then it just affects everything. So here are like a few ideas. If you want to establish a business case, to your boss or your board, why retention should be top of the agenda. These are some of the bullets that come to mind. And I'm also referencing an HR professional, itong si Elijah. You should just Google him. He's got a lot of books about this. The first is it's a lot more expensive to train new employees than to just nurture the ones you have inside. No, and that's a fact. On the flip side, it also works the other way. Like they said, the easiest way to increase your salary is to change jobs. That's good for employees, but from an HR and a company perspective, it's very expensive. If you keep losing people and you have keep hiring new people, then you'll tend to pay a little higher compared to just nurturing people organically. But it goes beyond also the cost, no, or the salary. It's also the morale, inefficiencies. Every time someone leaves, then there's destabilization in a company, and this can be hard, particularly if you're a company on a growth mode. I'm experiencing this right now, trying to ramp up a couple of the companies I'm managing. Every time somebody leaves, it's a big headache. In fact, I just had to manage the exit of one employee just the other day, and first thing I talked about to this person was, do you still have your heart in the job? Because there's no point countering an offer by a competitor if your heart isn't in it anymore. And yung sinabi niya na, yeah, my heart has moved on. I'm looking for other things. I'm also getting married. Circumstances change. So pag ganun wala na, I mean, for me, as a CEO, there's no point delaying the inevitable. But in practice, it's still shocking how many companies tend to counter offer employees, not forgetting the basic principle that if they were looking for a job in the first place, you're a bit late now the moment they start saying they're gonna go. You should have spotted that problem way, way back. And that attrition risk can be very disruptive. I think many CEOs don't understand just the value of this disruption, the fact that you can have, operations disrupted, teams go by, and you're also losing a lot of intellectual property or, efficiencies inside. No one can put a number on that. But I'm going to flip around that challenge. HR should be able to put a number on that because if there's one thing CEOs understand, it's probably numbers. Would you rather pay a couple hundred thousand to retain the people, or would you rather pay a couple of million, trying to replace everyone who just left? And maybe the root cause there is, why do we have such a horrible culture to begin with? That's the business case for retention. And every time someone leaves, then there's a multiplier effect. I remember reading somewhere, and I keep coming back to this. Resignation is like mass hysteria. Until the first person leaves, I don't know if you guys can relate to this. And if there's always like a threat of the company's going under or whatever, some really uncertainty there, or maybe the moment a favorite boss leaves, the moment the first person leaves, it's easier for the second person to go. So it's always managing that first departure. That's always that's the challenge. If people don't leave, then people will tend to stay. But the moment may isang umalis, it becomes easier to go, and you can have waves of departures from time to time. And that's why there are, from a data perspective, I always insist that there's a seasonality to departures, which also coincides with the recruitment season, right? And the other thing about departures is what I said earlier. They'll take the IP of the company, the intellectual property, to your competitors, and that's a huge strategic risk. So, di ba, parang if you're gonna weigh the cost and benefit, you know, you spend a little money, keep your employees happier, or you rather risk your secret sauce going to the competitor. It's really up to you. But most people don't even talk about that at a time when you're in a management meeting and you're HR and you're talking about retention statistics. It's the last thing on people's minds. For me as a CEO, that's the first thing I'm thinking about. How do I prevent my company secrets from going to the competitor? Especially now because I'm dealing in technology, which is very sensitive. And the rest of this is just, pretty much the same thing. If you have key workers leaving, then the morale can be very tough, and that's very expensive to fix if you have a morale issue. I've consulted for companies before, really big names. Some of it will be a surprise. They really have nice brands out there, but the moment you open the hood and you start talking to the employees, you realize they're really stagnated, and that's really the responsibility of management more than anything. It's not just HR. All the executives, the board, are responsible for keeping that culture intact. If the moment you lose that, that's it. On a more, I would say, mundane level, uh, and if you guys are tracking statistics like I love to, you'll see some common reasons for people to leave. Now, I'm going to mention this only because it merits some discussion on why people should be minding the data in terms of HR. First, people will always weigh the cost of moving into another career. No? Do I stick around? Because if you move, you have to uproot, and you have to also manage a new network, and of course there's the operational things you have to do, like sign up for new IDs, etc. But the moment it's easier to actually move, people will do, rather than stick around and deal with their horrible corporate culture. And then there's the perception of the benefits, and this is more than just the peso, benefits. There's always, I think this is the number one reason for many people who leave, is that they were offering me a better salary, or offering me better benefits. So that's likely a perception issue, more than anything. And the same with the weighing your benefits versus the opponent. All things taken equal, I'm going to get a 10% increase. I'm going to go with that. Then when maybe the question should have been, well, how come we didn't understand this person's motivation to begin with? Where is this person really sticking it out for the benefits, or sticking it out for the 10% compensation? Or have we created an employee base of mercenaries? That can happen. And knowing it ahead of time is crucial, no, in driving all of this. Okay. Not sure if it's just me that I'm not seeing the slideshow. Oh, okay. Is anyone still having problems, or can you see it? Sige. Just continue. Because I'm seeing it. Anyone else is having problems? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Some people also leave because of personal business. So may ganon. That's often a more common occurrence now, lalo na with the millennials. No? The millennials are quite open to taking on new businesses, and startups are all over the place. So now the question is, why would a person risk everything and start a new company rather than stick it out? So that's the question I would have if I see this statistic. And then there's the family. Like the employee was telling you just a minute ago, the person said, well, I'm getting into family problems already because they don't like the idea that I'm getting stressed. So they'd rather that I depart na lang. So ganun. Can you still see my screen? I'm seeing a lot of red here. No? Ayan, yeah. I think the screen's coming back. Okay. Religious beliefs. I don't see this come up very often, but occasionally it does happen, and this is a shame, no? Because this is often probably because there's some bullying happening in the office, lalo na if you happen to operate in an area that's got a lot of religious diversity, that can happen. And then personal values. I think this is probably the most important. If when you're doing the recruitment, more than the skills, more than the actual so the salary they want, you have to have a better way of gauging this person's values. What are they looking for? And mind you, people nowadays find better and better ways of acing the interview questions. No? Medyo hindi na siya foolproof. So you have to be quite adept in reading between the lines. But on the flip side, and I'll talk about something related to this later, there are also other ways of verifying a person, because social media is such a transparent medium. And I don't know how many employers should be doing this. But for me, if I'm hiring a particular executive, I'll tell you now, I check what they're doing on social media. If they're on Facebook, are they posting crazy, stupid things? Or if they're on LinkedIn, what do they really do? People kind of mistakenly assume that their digital persona is separate from their professional one. I would disagree. Because that's the face you put out in public. And later it becomes a reputational risk if you have one of your key officers, posting really stupid things on social media. Lalo na ngayon in an era of fake news and Twitter. And then pressure of associates. Usually this is both internal pressure, people are getting bullied, they want to go, politics, or people have already left. So I was saying earlier, it becomes mass hysteria at the moment a group of people leave. Now, the opportunity there is, how often does HR or management take time to understand sino ba yung mga grupo dito sa company, lalo na if it's quite a big company. You should be able to map out who are cliques, who are like virtual teams, or who are like friends and groups, because that's how information spreads. And from a data perspective, that means making sure that you're on top of all the corporate communications happening, the emails people send to each other, you know, uh, snooping onto emails when it's public, that's bad, no? But if you're in a company, your employer has every right to look at what you're writing on an email, who you're sending it to. Because it could be, it could be a reputational risk, or it could be company secrets you're leaking out, or maybe you're bogging down the entire email server sending crazy pictures lang. No? So it's well within the rights of companies to do that. But guess what? Probably doesn't happen. I've never seen it happen between HR and IT, for example, and looking at emails being sent across. Although I think that should be important. Like one thing I would encourage you guys to Google in your free time is Google the Enron dataset. I don't know how many of you remember, Enron was this famous company that went bankrupt in the late 90s, early 2000s. And they posted all the emails of the employees online publicly, no, for people to analyze. And you'll see how information spreads like wildfire. No? Some people who may not really look important, but when you look at the emails they're sending, sila pala yung influencer. Or lalo na in companies where there's like an underground network of employees trying to marshal people into going on strike or etc. You'll see early signs of it if you're able to monitor the emails. So I think that should be something that people should look into. And then the medical reason, usually the excuse, if in my opinion, people are ashamed to admit that they're taking higher salary. They'll say, I'm getting sick and this isn't for me. And then the next thing you know, they're already working in the competitor. I'm just saying that because I've seen it in the flesh. So this kind of like summarizes the top, but 9 reasons for staff. So why bother? And there could be more. You guys might have your own list. The point I'm going to make here is that all of these reasons can be monitored from a data perspective. If HR and management and IT had a better sense of the digital persona of employees, it's much like marketers are trying to figure out their customers through the data traces they leave in products and services. Employees should be assessed as well, no? Because what people do and evidenced by the data that they leave can be a big indicator on the kind of employee you have. And the latter half of my talk will center on this: how to kind of get better at looking at employee data, and that kind of drives with all of the discussion on digital, because digital is all about data. So this is the mission for most of us, C-levels and HR professionals. We need to understand our employees better. That's the solution to all of these problems. If we know them better, more than what we think, more than what they put on their CV, we're able to understand their behaviors better. There's a lot of psychology majors, for example, in HR, but how often do you get to practice your psychographic analysis on employee data? Probably never. But if you're able to gather that from employee surveys and from the behavior of these people online, then maybe you might have some indicators. So I mean that's my passion, as a believer in better data management and data-driven solutions. So this is a shorter list. Ano ba talaga yung, what do they really want? And I'm not citing a source here. This is probably what every other source on the internet would say. Employees are very, very partial to very clear processes. The more you remove ambiguity in a company, the better it is for everyone. There's so many times I've encountered, even for myself, where I was compelled to, raise an issue because I can't understand what people are supposed to do. And sometimes it's funny. I've met people who have gone for years in their job, and they don't really quite understand exactly what their role is. It's because, it's not very clear. The second bullet is always the case. People don't like being micromanaged. But what they don't say is they also value feedback. And again, this is another opportunity for data and companies to improve on. How often does feedback happen? I would probably say 80 to 90% of companies, the only time you give feedback is when you're doing the mandatory performance review. Very few managers Very few, executives enforce, the constant feedback mechanism. Minsan, it's a culture already. You don't want to give feedback at all. Nahihiya na yung mga tao, and that's a slippery slope. Continuous learning, career development, everyone asks for this. If you're going to stick it out, even if the competitor has a higher salary, but if there's always something new to learn and you can develop your career, I think this has a very, very, I would say, different spin when you're talking to the millennial generation. And when I say millennial, these are people who were born post 1980, lalo na those who were born post 1990. They tend to be quite passionate about social change. Their attention spans are very short. They base everything on whatever they read online. So their view of the world is at odds, no, with the people who were born before them, lalo na the baby boomer generation. So understanding this, how do you provide continuous learning for people who probably know a lot already to begin with because they're voracious readers on the internet? And what is career development for them? And then the latter two are really quite obvious. People like it when the performance is based on facts, not opinions. It's data driven. So appraisal should be data driven as much as possible, and open communication. So it's not really anything new. It's not really rocket science, but I'm bringing this up because it helps cement the next few points that I will gonna make. By the way, there's gonna be a Q&A at the end of the session. You can just send me questions via chat, or if you feel compelled to send me a question at any point now, you should do so, and then I'll address your questions towards the end. Okay, so there's this quote that I found, no? Talent drain. And he said 81% of organizations perceive turnover as having a negative effect on their effectiveness. So obvious, no? 81% of people think if we have a lot of turnover, medyo malabo yan. That's obvious. Now, there's another statistic that many people probably don't, you probably know intuitively, but I'd say it's highly correlated to this. And that is 85% of organizations perceive HR as very weak in data analytics. And this is from a survey that Deloitte put together in 2014. I'll show some more data on this. The reason why I'm putting these two together is I believe that they're related. For those companies who are worried about turnover, incidentally, are also companies who are also quite impaired in their ability to analyze their employee base, or quite impaired in their ability to understand their employees better. And my view is if you can get better at that, then you kind of solve the other problem as well. You see, Deloitte did a survey on this, and they asked, can you rank, I think they asked about 1,000 companies, which one of your corporate functions have a really strong digital and analytics capabilities? And obviously, the usual suspects come up, like marketing, operations, sales, and finance. But only 15% say HR does. And I think we're already at the time when you cannot tolerate this. Before, pwede pa. HR departments tend to be quite manual about things. I know this from experience. And that's part of the challenge. How are you going to manage retention if half of the time you're still busy processing paper? That's the big ask. Even these other departments also tend to be quite manual with what they do. But I think what we're talking about here is HR. That's the low hanging fruit, and it doesn't take much nowadays. Before it used to be a major investment, now it's not, and the reason is there's a lot of online services. If you guys are open to outsourcing this, I show some of the kind of those companies later, and also the principles behind it. That's my view as a CEO. Okay, so which brings us to the talent management pillars: onboarding, learning, performance, compensation, and communication. Again, nothing new. Now, what I have an issue here is many companies will really manage talent this way. There will be one team looking at onboarding, there'll be another team looking at learning, there'll be another team looking at performance, and another team looking at compensation, and then lastly, the PR and the communication. And it can get quite siloed. And that's primarily a data challenge also. If your recruitment team and your learning team don't talk to each other, then how are you going to really come up with a very coordinated and cohesive, retention strategy? If the people managing compensation and benefits are not talking to the people managing, feedback and performance, then how can you really relate? You know, how can you ensure that people feel rewarded for the good work that they've done? So that's, the ask for any company. It's not just HR. How do you make sure while you're managing these five things separately, make sure that they're running off, common information base, they're running off similar digital tools, union, and that's just one step in the right direction, and that leads to the efficiency that hopefully we see more in the marketplace. So what I want to suggest, and again, this is just my view, not as an HR professional, but more as person managing three companies. My aspiration, my ideal scenario is digital retention. So it's not just retention for its own sake, which is always a problem. How do you make use of digital in helping retain good talent? And I think that is one area. This is one major area which will differentiate companies later on, their ability to retain talent. And there are three aspects to this. I don't want to oversimplify it, but at least I'm just going to talk about three things. The first is managing what I would say the employee life cycle. So the same way marketers look at the customer life cycle from the moment they buy your first product all the way to the time they leave you for a competitor. Ganun din, no, employees. The moment they are recruited and they're given their job description, and the moment they're trained and they hop around and get promoted, all the way down to the exit, right? They separate or they are redundated or they retire, or preferably they retire because they spend their lifetime there. That's a life cycle. And guess what? It's not easy to do that, like, because companies are very different from each other. Employees' experiences are very different, and it's not uncommon to find cases where, in the case of one employee, they had a really great 10, 20 years in one company, and in another case, another employee left after 18 months. Each employee is kind of unique, but the stages in the life cycle are all very similar. Let me, I'll zoom in on this. That's the first pillar of this strategy. The second is what I mentioned earlier, this new realm of what I would say HR analytics. And again, I don't want to waste a lot of time talking about visualizations and charts. It's not the point now. Mamaya I'll zoom into some of this. But what I'm trying to point out here is, I think what will make great companies and great HR departments in the near future will be the ones who can manage data to such an extent that they can ask really, really hard-hitting and concise questions about their employees. Because those questions are the ones that will shape the strategy of the company. And then the third pillar is targeting. So parang marketing din, no? You want to target customers, for example, who will buy your product. In the same manner, employees as well. No? You want to target employees who, one, will bring a lot of value to your company, and two, have a lesser risk of turnover. Because if you keep throwing money at high performers, but they keep leaving, that's still expensive. What you want are high performers or high value employees, but also the ones who tend to be loyal. And that's again a matter of classifying and managing your HR data better. I'm not really a big fan of there's lots of these tools, like the bell curve. I think that's a GE tool, and all these other HR models. I mean, some of them come, some of them go. But what I am a fan of is not necessarily ranking people, but assessing their individual needs and their fit for a company. And then that allows HR and me to know, this person, let's develop this person because they really enjoy working here. They would contribute more if they could. So let's invest in them. As opposed to, the high flyers, okay, sige, they're really, really good. But you also know they're mercenaries, no? So you throw money at them, the moment, the next thing you know, they're flying to the competitor. And that's, some people are like that. But from a retention strategy, quite expensive. So that's the balance we have to strike. So I'll talk about these three things, in some more detail. But that's kind of like in my head how I would like to view retention in the digital age. And this is just again a view. It will probably change over time as more and more tools and techniques get better. And at the end of the day, this is also the what I would say the areas where companies can do much better. Wait, let me just yeah, okay. I think you can see it now. Okay. So this is the employee life cycle. So recruitment, what's this? Expectancy, the formative days, development, the growth and enablement, the work/life actualization, and the separation. So these are really cool terms now because they kind of map very closely to a customer life cycle, which I like because I have a marketing background as well. So I think more and more HR departments and companies will need to manage their brand to employees in the same manner they manage their brand to customers. And there are certain time periods. No? So the moment, for example, you recruit, the moment you open a position to the moment you hire, the challenge there is you want to make sure you're hiring faster, you're lowering the cost. But more than both, you want to make sure that the right candidate is selected, both for their fit and their skills. In fact, if I will prioritize, I'd go with fit muna. Because if part of fit is the ability to learn new things, then skills is something you can teach, which is really at odds with a lot of, I would say, executive search and recruitment companies. They go by checklists. Do you know this programming language? How many years have you spent in this particular industry? Check, check, check. And then they send the CV across. But then that just means HR has to do double time in assessing, okay, these guys passed paper screening. Am I getting the right candidate from a fit standpoint? Okay, so you've hired the person. So from hiring to start, that's expectancy. How do you shorten the time between the person saying yes to the time they're actually productive? And this is a ramp up stage, which is a combination of training and also enculturation. This at the same time you're training people the things they need to know so that they can do work for you. You're also in a way bombarding them with the values of your company. And hopefully you manage that within the 6-month probationary period. Yun yung crucial. No? Sometimes I would say that's probably unfair. Pero that's the only window you have. Because the moment they cross the 6-month threshold and they have the wrong values about the company, then it's going to be an expensive process. So ramp up to productivity is both skills and I think values. Then the first 2 weeks, this is where you engage them, you give them orientation, you onboard them. I'd say 90% of the time, your likelihood of sticking around in a company is shaped by those first 2 weeks. If the experience is pleasant and you don't run into any grumpy executives in the first 2 weeks, then it's good. No? People often remember the first time they see the boss and what they said for some reason. No? And that's how much power the boss has. So if you're the boss or if you're HR, just make sure that experience is really good. Kasi you may end up regretting it, several years down the line. Then 2 weeks to 6 months, the development stage. You're giving them the tools and the skills. You're introducing the reward and recognition. You're making sure they're aligned with the team goals. And then from 6 to 24 months, this is the growth stage. I'd say this is the honeymoon stage, 6 to 2 years. Because people never think of leaving unless it was a really bad experience within the first 2 years. The moment they hit 2 years, then people start asking, am I really growing in this organization? Am I getting what I want? Blah, blah, blah. So that's the avenue to really reinforce relationships, a career path. You've got 24 months to do that. Beyond 24 months, yan na, work-life balance ng usapan. Because some people might say, you know what, maybe I'm not going to get promoted as fast, but I get to go home early, good. Or, I'm getting married, I'm starting a family, so this is a stable company. Or maybe I'm not going to get as paid as much as the competitor, but I have really great mentors here. That's after the 2-year mark. And beyond 2 years, there's always going to be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 reasons to depart if the first 2 years in a company wasn't done, really well. So it's kind of like a raffle by the time you get to that point. Now, beyond 2 years, let's say there comes a point when the employee really needs to leave for one reason or another. It's still the obligation, I think, of the company to make sure that that separation is done properly, even if it was because of performance, even if kwenta na lang if they committed fraud, no, so just get rid of them as fast as you can, no? But when you're looking at departing employees, make sure that you get all the feedback properly, and it's the real feedback, not just what they want you to hear. Because the moment they leave, then now they become either an advocate of your company or a detractor. So parang net promoter score sa marketing. Your best advocates are former employees who maybe for one reason or another just had to go, maybe for career development, but they enjoyed the time you were there, they'll recommend you. And then that reinforces, no? It becomes viral when you start to attract new candidates. So that's the life cycle. I think the message I want to leave here is how deliberate is a company's strategy on each stage. Kailangan mamapa yan. If not in reality, based on surveys, it should be done hypothetically. More than just identifying the mission, vision, and goals of the company. After that, you need to identify what's the ideal customer journey. Some companies will be short-term gigs by default, lalo na the sales-driven ones. Majority of your employees are salespeople, so they will leave once they don't get their commissions, right? But some other companies, manufacturing operations, there's more investment that needs to be done in retaining them, because these are people who probably don't want to be jumping around anyway. So you want to give them that environment for them to stick around. So there's really a lot we can talk about the life cycle, but because of time, I'm just going to leave it at that. Just be conscious of this, because it then helps reinforce the other 2 points I want to make. So after life cycle, the big discussion now is, okay, what kind of analytics should HR do? And I'm not going to go through a long list of HR KPIs. I just want to know if, I'm the boss, do we have enough data to kind of ask 4 questions? The first question is, I really want to know if there are big segments in my employee base. Same way I want to know my customer base. Gusto ko malaman yung employee base. And there are many models for this. I'm not going to prescribe any. HR folks probably know it better than I do. There's the MBTI model, the Ocean model, the psychographic model, whatever it may be. It's great insight to understand what kind of employees do we have. Are our employees primarily introverted, extroverted? What kind of activities do they want? Any way you can group employees together can be great in understanding, the likelihood of them sticking around. And this is a major, investment, not just from a data perspective, but from a time perspective, because you really, HR departments, CEOs, we need to understand, okay, these are the kind of people our brand is attracting. Am I okay with that? Or am I, are we getting infiltrated by a different type of employee? And if so, what are we prepared to do about it? So there's a lot of questions this thing will actually generate. But the important thing is to start that way. Let's look at the preferences of our employees and segment them if we can. And this is more than just demographic segmentation, which is a good place to start. Also want to understand what are their likes, what are their what are their their behaviors, not just on inside the company, but again, I'm a big advocate of assessing what do people do outside the company which could potentially harm us. Let's segment them that way. This thing keeps pausing. Okay, let me check. Okay. Yeah. Can you see my screen again? Wala siya. Okay. It doesn't work. Yeah. Okay, the next one is, if you've already segmented them, you want to look at associations. No? So when I say associations, what 2 things go together? Like, do most of our employees love to, go out, or are they more of an introverted bunch? Do they love reading books? So these are things that, most people probably don't want to take the time to do. But given enough data, in a company, you can probably put these two and two together. This You want to look at the co-occurrence of relation and the relationship of demographics in relation to where they are in their life cycle, what happens in the company. Like, I know there are some companies, for example, they love to do these year-end events, no? Not realizing what actually employees are after in these events. Some people are just there for the food, some people are just there to dance, some people are just there for the music. Just understanding them, lalo na with this millennial generation, they're quite temperamental. You make a mistake and your CEO says something about global warming and you're all pissed off. So these behaviors are good insights, no, for management, because let's face it, management will usually be the older bunch of people, and we all need clues on why these kids are thinking this way, etc., etc. And we're not only thinking of the kids, we're also looking at some of our older employees. What are they looking forward to? Their retirement, etc. What kind of behaviors are they exhibiting? This sounds a bit techy, no, complex events, but this is from an analytics perspective. You want to trace the root cause of something. So, for example, this comes in handy in resignations. Baka pala there was this one particular thing that keeps popping up, and that's causing people to resign. It can be anything, like a particular boss is the biggest contributor to all of the resignations in the company. That is valuable data. Maybe that guy or girl needs coaching in how to be a better leader. And the only way to give that feedback is if you have data to show. Hey, look, mate, 80% of the last resignations came from your department. What's happening? And of course, they'll say, well, it's not my fault. It's what's happening. No, no, it is somewhat related to your behavior. And these are the things that are coming. So that's one angle. The other angle can be looking at compensation and benefits, and just understanding, are we paying too much or too little? That's what's causing people to depart their jobs. Complex events can be anything. And again, the bottom line here is I want to look at cause and effect. Of course, the saying is correlation and causation aren't necessarily the same thing, but it helps to have something, right? And that gives management some actionable insights in terms of what to do better. Can be a broken process. Most of our resignations come from particular department, and that's because we recently overhauled the office. Like, I know of one company, for example, they lost a lot of people. Why? Because they moved locations. They used to be in a particular location, which was convenient for their employees, and then corporate decision to move, not realizing that if they had done an analysis of where people lived, then that should have been part of the consideration, right? If you're going to move to a more corporate setting, is that an additional 1 hour commute for most of our employees? And that will be an attrition risk for us. BPOs are very good at this because they really look at strategic implications of location. And the last bit is what I would call performance attribution. You want to start modeling what makes a really good performer, and not just from a skills perspective, but the way they develop, where did we recruit them, who was their boss, what kind of onboarding did they have. And I also teach HR analytics to some companies. You'd be surprised at how predictive some of these data can be if you're able to gather them. Hey, majority of our top performers pala, not necessarily came from the same school, but they were mentored by the similar set of managers, and they all worked on similar set of projects. Then you want to understand why. What's with this? And you only get to this point if you've already gathered years and years of information. So most companies probably won't even begin to get to this level of insight. But it's always good to have this in mind when you're looking in the future. And I'm sure some companies already have this information, they just don't have it in one convenient spot, which is another point I want to make in a minute. So these are like just four examples, but you can see how powerful this can be. If your HR information system can be analyzed to generate some of this information, it can make for some very, very thought-provoking and also confronting discussion. Ito pala yung biggest cause of our departure. And are we ready as a company to face it? So what does that mean from a retention perspective? Well, if you have all that information, then it's quite straightforward to put together something like this. No? You want to look at targeting the right set of employees. And this is just two axes. You can have your own, but I find this part quite helpful. You want to look at the likelihood of a person to depart based on whatever factors, the attrition score or whatever. And then on another axis, you want to look at how much value does this person contribute to us today. And when I say value, it's not necessarily getting high performance appraisals because that can also be quite subjective. Actual business and cultural value. They may not be the best performing salesperson, but they're the mentor pala of the ones who are the top performers. So capturing all this information will lead to this. And then you'll be able to group people on, you know, the ones who are quite high risk of turnover and they don't add lots of value, then okay lang, let them go. Maybe they deserve to be elsewhere, or at least there's less value for you to hang on to them. The ones naman who are adding a lot of value but are also high turnover, well, that means you have to re-recruit them every time. So you want to minimize that as much as you can. On the other hand, the ones who want to stick around, so there'll be those guys, and they're the ones who are not adding as much value, then this is an opportunity to nurture them. So they're already loyal, so that's great. But maybe, they're not being developed enough, so you want to nurture these people. How do you bring their value up? And then lastly, the ones who are quite loyal and adding a lot of value, you want to hang on to these guys as much as you can. Because this is the golden, kind of like the golden group. These are the ones who probably are not being, rewarded as much. You're not spending a lot on them because they're not as noisy as the high turnover bunch. But when you assess all the factors, they're really what makes your company tick. So again, you can have probably more dimensions to this. I'm just showing that the main point about doing all of this complex stuff, relatively, is to get to this decision point. Then now, as a manager or as a CEO, I can decide to, okay, how come we have a lot of guys here in the high turnover, high value situation? What can we do to make them more loyal to us? Or what can we do to stop adding to that population? Are we overpaying people? That's why they're becoming mercenaries. On the other hand, how come I have a very low population of people, who I also have a growing population of people who are quite loyal, but they're not really adding value? What can we do to make them more valuable to us? And that can, help prioritize this investments in terms of people development. And then the cost can easily be identified. Like if I'm going to reinvest in the re-recruit bunch, mas mahal, no? I'm going to pay double. Then if I had just to, spend some money nurturing na lang the ones who are already here. So, that kind of discussion can be quite objective. So I guess this will, bring us to the point of all of this is not possible if the data you need, here we go again, where's this post? Okay. If the data you need is not in a great place, no? Yeah, I'm just struggling with this interface right now. Okay. Ayun niya. Maybe we should do this. Yeah, better. So it all boils back to what would typically be known as the HR information system. Most companies have one or trying to have one, or they have one, but it's broken. The boxes I've laid out here are just kind of the general things that I would look for in a good system, very, quite high level. First is it has to be easy to access. So if it's not on an intranet or a cloud something platform, and I have to kind of talk to someone to get data pa, then that's an immediate problem for me as a CEO. Because that means a question I want answered today will take 3 weeks, 2 weeks, maybe even 2 months to answer. And what kind of decisions can we do on that? So solve that problem immediately. If you're not able to create a system that can easily be accessed, and by the way, after this slide, there'll be examples of, some companies who are offering this as a service, just for you guys to have a look. I'm not saying you should buy their services. Very important. You might have the information already. It's just inconvenient to get. That's a problem. Fix that problem. Now, what kind of information do we need? Of course, you have the usual reports and dashboards, and this can range from the usual stuff that you have to, you know, uh, uh, submit to the government, or reports that management needs for its, for its meetings, down to this what I would call predictive analytics. So, some examples I showed earlier, down to what we call self-service query, meaning there should be an ability for anyone to ask a question without having to go through, hoops, generating that information. And that's where a lot of these new online and digital services really shine, because they're really, really quite simple. Even a non-techie can use them. But guess what? All of the legacy HR and ERP systems, from experience, they can get quite hard to use. And the irony there is sometimes people buy a really expensive system, but they end up not putting anything on it. It's all on Excel. Why? Because it's so hard to use. And that right there is it's a way. So, try not to get into that situation, or if you're in that situation, try to get out of it. Now, the bottom box is what I would call the HR data mart. This is like maybe high-level groupings of information. Like, I'm a data professional, so this is kind of how I will look at it. What kind of data should HR be tracking? And it goes beyond just 201 files, right? First is reporting lines and organization structure. This should be tracked. How often do people move around? Who reports to what? What has your reporting history been before you used to report to this boss? You're going to report to that boss again, etc. Organization structure is something that can be quite predictive of performance. Some people perform better in a particular structure than others. So track that information. Job descriptions and role grading, I think this is a classic. What I would want from this information is, how have our job descriptions evolved over time? If you still have JDs that are 30 years old, I would highly doubt if that job description is still relevant today. Somehow jobs have changed over time, and how often are they changed? And I just want to call out a particular experience I had back in banking, when sometimes JDs are also an opportunity for people to game the system. People write a job, they write all sorts of really cool descriptions. Why? Because certain keywords would then allow it to be assessed at a higher level, and that gives them the opportunity to promote people. That's really unproductive. You write the job description to reflect what the job is for, you pay the right amount for that job, and everything else is performance based. But it's easier said than done. Recruitment is a box in itself. You want to track not just the CVs, but also where they came from, what are your recruitment channels, how much you spent for each recruit or planning to spend. That's a huge database in itself, which relates then to the finance and performance management. So if the recruitment box is people you have yet to onboard, finance and performance management are people you already have onboarded, and you want to track how much you've spent over the time of that employee, not just in terms of benefits and compensation, but in terms of other things like training. Compensation benefits is a box in itself. You also want to track the history of people's pay. You want to look at trends related to that and benchmark that against competition. The latter two, I would say, are often overlooked, but I'd say they're important for HR as well. First is corporate communication. Corporate communication is everything from emails to chats to ads. And the reason why I think HR should pay mind here is this is often a hidden source of insight. Like, for example, if you run a call center, there's always a journal, no? When people input comments about customers. Some agents use this as a diary, for stuff that they often won't tell their managers, and no one actually looks at this stuff. All the way down to emails. Emails are always good. And if they're using like social media in a company, some companies just conveniently block Facebook and Twitter, or Instagram from their systems. Maybe that does the trick initially, but trust me, some people will find a way to access, to social media, whether through their phones or whatever. Rather than blocking it, find a way to monitor it instead, because it can be very, very revealing what people share online, what that means for the company. And then that ties in with the last box, which is feedback and engagement surveys. It's often interesting to see, in a survey, employees would say this, but then when you look at Facebook, they say something completely different. Both pieces of information should be compared. If you're just reliant on surveys, then you have to admit already that the information is already skewed to begin with. But that's still much better than having no survey. But again, I also have been witness to interesting behavior in companies, lalo na multinationals, for example. Every time there's a global, engagement survey, which is often run from, the head office somewhere, there's like an ad campaign happening on the ground. Managers are encouraging their employees, treating them well, para mas skew yung results. Come on, guys, let's be honest. You want these surveys to reflect the reality, and you don't want to game the system. So at the end of the day, it's like an audit. You don't want to, keep cleaning up just for the audit and allow a major flaw to go by unnoticed. It's often better to just have people answer honestly, and then find out what's wrong. But again, that's a corporate culture. Some companies have it, some companies don't. Okay, so which then brings us to some examples. No, so I wanted to show. There's a lot. No, so I don't know if you've heard of a company called Zenefits and Centrifugo, and I'm just showing you the menus here. These are examples of companies who have started to offer a cloud-based HRIS. So if you information there, and I would say, based as a data professional and someone who actually uses some of this stuff, uh, okay, is that it's often better to just rely on this if you don't have a major IT department to begin with, and make sure that the data is being inputted properly. So you can see they're really quite complex. So itong Zenefits that I think is based in the US, everything from payroll, employees, contractors, stock options, it's all there. It's all clickable. Si Centrifugo, ganun din. There are more pala. No? I'm just showing examples that nowadays, it's quite easy na to get started. If you're a small company, you want to get up and running quickly, rather than hiring IT to create a totally new system or buy an expensive one. Try this, some of these systems, because you often pay per use lang, and you can select the package that you want from some of them. Uh, and then the other trend I wanted to show is there's actually a lot of companies that are offering services. Some of them are social networks that are really driven by people data. So you have Glassdoor. If you're not familiar with Glassdoor, I'd be very surprised. So this is a website which gathers feedback from people who work in a company or left the company. And the company page is managed by a representative of the company. Glassdoor is very particular that it's an HR representative or a senior executive that does the management. Para you can really represent yourself. Pero they will not filter the reviews. It's really there so that you get all the reviews coming to you objectively. Of course, you've heard of Workday. They're similar to Zenefits and Centrifugo. They're also an HR operations management system. It also ties in with your ERP system. So Workday's, I think, they've been around for a while. Of course, everyone now knows LinkedIn. LinkedIn is for networking and learning. And I think I would probably be accurate to say that the era of the standalone CV, walk-in CV is probably dead. Some companies still do this. And now it's the era of LinkedIn. If you're not on LinkedIn, then it's really, you will, it's going to be much harder for you to find a job. And people check LinkedIn. The moment you meet somebody, you check them agad sa LinkedIn, because that's really where it's kind of like the Facebook, but for professionals. Some companies still don't use LinkedIn as much, but you can also manage a company page here for free and look at trends related to who's inquiring about your company. And there's also a paid service if you're an HR professional. You can get more insight about your employees. Then there's a relatively new site called Caliber. This is like the latest in the string of recruitment and jobs websites like JobStreet and JobsDB. What Caliber does better, though, is that it has machine learning and AI that matches CVs to a job opening. So it's not a human being lang. No? They also have recruitment consultants, but there's actually some AI already in the system. So that's why if you're a recruiter or you're a company, you post a job at Caliber, it really requires you to put the right details there and make sure that your company's information is complete. On the flip side, if you're an applicant and Caliber asks you to take some assessments, also fill up your information, and ang maganda pa rito, both the applicant and the recruiter can rate each other. No? So a recruiter can rate an applicant if they don't show up for an interview and it affects their future prospects of getting an interview. In the same manner, applicants can also rate companies now based on the experience in getting recruited. So may pagka-Glassdoor din siya. So the point I want to make here is these are companies that are growing quite fast. And the reason why they're growing is because there is no capability, in most HR departments to do this. But in theory, if people were managing their data better, then these companies would not have any customers. So I mean, that's just the point I want to make. And this is the digital era already. But on the flip side, maybe HR shouldn't really, spend too much time designing a system from scratch. Maybe for some companies, you can just go to some of these services and just pay per use. No? So it's really up to the company to decide which is the better, I would say, data strategy for your HR department. Just be aware that these solutions already exist out there, and uh, if you can't beat them, join them. At the same time, make sure you just don't join any service without assessing first what is the value. Same way, you probably shouldn't be buying an HRIS or an ERP system if you're not going to use it. Which brings us to the takeaways. So I think hopefully that didn't bore you. First is retention begins by understanding your employees better. And I think that's the rule. Most of the time, people leave for whatever reason. It's because the company didn't figure it out much earlier, and that's a cost for you. If you don't know who your employees are, what their behaviors are, then that's a liability. The second is HR data and analytics can be effective tools in making a retention strategy. So if you have a retention strategy and it's not backed up by data, then I have very, very low expectations that you're going to be effective. It's like you can't make decisions anymore that are actually effective ones. You have to have some data at least backing them up. If not, then you have to think about how you're going to get better at it. And then lastly, there is a business case for retention. So if in your companies it's not a major issue or it's not top of the agenda, then I would really question why that's still the case. Okay. So yeah, that's that. If you want to ask questions, I think there's a question box on your chat. So I'm happy to entertain questions now. Any questions? I hope I didn't put you guys to sleep. Wala. Mukhang ano. Okay, so with that, I want to thank everyone for attending the webinar. If you have a question about my presentation or any of the slides, you can drop me an email at dominic.ligot@Cyrolytics. It's with a double R and a Y.com. You can also find me on Twitter, Ligot, and on LinkedIn. So my credentials are on the screen. I'm turning you back now to Rina for anything else.
Hi, Doc. Do you guys have a question? I could see a raise of hands. You can type your questions on the chat box on the lower corner of our screen.
Yeah, I think I'm seeing some. Okay. Any suggestion of data analytics tool in the market now? Okay, I think that's a good question. Okay, so there's the right answer and the real answer. The right answer is there's a lot. Of course, there are the usual suspects like Microsoft Excel, and some of the really fancy ones like what IBM and SAS are selling. The good news is, kasi all of those require, programming or really heavy IT expertise. And honestly, and this is me speaking both as a data professional and also as a technically, I'm not really a techie. I didn't start out as one. I don't have an IT degree, but I just learned it on the job. There's actually a lot of free stuff out there, open source stuff. I think the question is really identifying muna what kind of analytics you want to do, and then looking out in the market of what's a good tool. Believe it or not, even Excel can be quite helpful, provided you know really what to do with it. Now, on the other hand, Excel is still, for example, something that's quite manual. So some of the companies I showed earlier, yung mga online services, they already have some built-in data analytics on it. For as long as you populate the data properly, may mga reports ka na makukuha. I think what's really going to be interesting is, especially when I'm just going to flash that slide earlier, no? Like those 4 questions I mentioned, this stuff usually doesn't come out of the box from any tool. It's something where you need to gather some data and start drawing some correlations. And some people hire even a statistician inside their, in their HR departments to figure it out. That's not a bad idea, but you don't want to go out and hiring statisticians before the fact. Start defining first what questions you want to ask, and then you can go and resource, people for it. Incidentally, just a subtle plug, that's also the service my company performs. No? So, but we focus mostly on small and medium enterprises. So if you have problems with managing your data, or you want to generate some of these great reports, and not really pay the extremely high cost of a licensed solution, then maybe we might be able to do something for you, because we build stuff from scratch. But that takes time to develop. Sometimes it's better to just buy something off the shelf. And then requesting for a copy of the presentation, just feel free to email me directly, especially if you have questions on it. Usually, I just ask exactly what are you looking for, because I've done a lot. By the way, I will give you copies of the slides, but I'm also curious exactly what particular part you found interesting. It helps me improve the talks I do in the future.